What's up, everyone? Kevin Carrillo here, and welcome to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast. My guest today is Rod Kight, attorney at Kight on Cannabis. Rod Kight, how are you, sir?
I'm great, Kevin. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Really excited to jump into a lot of topics. I know you have a huge breadth of knowledge and expertise when it comes to the cannabis industry, so I'm really excited for you to share it with us. Before we get started, I know that you're in Asheville, North Carolina. So how are you out there? How are you and your family doing during this pandemic?
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, things are radically different from the way they were prior to COVID. That's for sure. My office is downtown. I live about 10 minutes from my office, and fortunately, we're set up so that it was a pretty easy transition to work from home. But of course, our travel schedule, which is fairly insane. I say our because my wife is my office manager and kind of runs the show behind the scenes. We were traveling like crazy, and all that just went pow and stop. So we're getting I think probably a much needed break. Life is a little more slower paced. We're able to relax and think about things more rather than just the bam, 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 bam. That being said, we have 5 teenagers. We have a blended family, and the teenagers are not very happy about the COVID stuff. We had them on lockdown for a while, but that's impossible to lock down teenagers. So they're out and about, and we just try to keep them safe. That's all we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel bad for the younger, kids right now, especially when it comes to school. It's like they're having to be online for these classes. It's like going to school with no friends, basically.
It is. Yeah, no, for sure. We have twins who just were seniors in high school. They're going to college in a couple of weeks. We're just planning that. And they had one of these graduation ceremonies where, you drive through a parking lot and you get out and they take a picture and you're, 6 feet away from everybody. It was crazy. I felt bad for them. The flip side of that, it's pretty unique historically. That's for sure. They were the COVID graduating class.
Right. Yeah, I saw funny memes that were like a picture of the 1990s and what a drive-by looked like, and then in 2020 a drive-by where they're honking and celebrating graduations. So
Yeah, for sure.
they've changed that way. So tell me, Rod, I know you're one of the leading cannabis attorneys, not only in the country but in the world, right? And I'm curious to know like how you got started, right? You're an attorney. Did you start to focus on cannabis law at first, or did you shift? Like, what made you get into the industry?
Yeah, good question. So I didn't start with cannabis law at first. I've been practicing law for a little over 20 years now. And in my time practicing law, I've intentionally practiced a lot of different areas to get a broad wealth of knowledge of just about the practice of law itself. And there are several different areas that interest me. I got interested in cannabis law about 10 years ago when I had testicular cancer. And during that time period where I was undergoing chemotherapy and treatments for cancer, I used cannabis. And frankly, at the time, I didn't think of it as a medicine. I was not opposed to it. I used cannabis recreationally, as they say. But I thought I would give it a shot because I'd heard that it helped with some of the nausea that you experience through chemotherapy. And I did, and without expecting a whole lot, it really blew my mind. I mean, the nausea was was reduced significantly, and then aches and pains were reduced, and that you have sort of flu-like symptoms when you go through lots of different types of chemotherapy, and those were reduced. I was able to eat, and so it really opened my mind to cannabis as medicine, and became something that was more than recreational. I realized that it was powerful, and so this was about the time that laws were changing across the country. There was some real traction, but being in North Carolina, which remains a prohibition state, it was difficult to figure out how to get involved. And so back in 2014, I started exploring how I could get involved. And as part of that process, I looked for books and things that would educate me on cannabis law. So, if you want to go into tax law or workers' compensation law or state and whatnot, there are all sorts of legal books. We call them horn books that sort of lay out the basis for the law in that area. And there were no cannabis law horn books. They just didn't exist. And I had done some writing in another area of law that I practiced for years, which is bankruptcy law. And a publisher reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you like to write another book on bankruptcy law?" And I said, "Well, I've got another idea on cannabis law." And they thought that was interesting. They actually liked that. They ran it up to flagpole and they thought it was interesting. And so I pulled stuff from the internet and different things and actually compiled what at the time was the first business law book on cannabis law. And that was published in 2015. And then I started writing the blog, and I got licensed in Oregon, which is not a prohibition state. And that the things just sort of moved from there. I will say a big, for my practice, a big piece of it was the 2014 Farm Bill, which legalized industrial hemp for the first time in almost 100 years. And that's when we started to see the CBD industry emerge. And I had clients who were calling up and saying, "Hey, is CBD legal? And what circumstances?" And I, through that process and research and a lot of thinking, developed what's become known as the source rule, which determines whether a cannabinoid, in this case it was CBD, is legal or not. And I started writing on that, and people started reaching out to me, and things just kept going. And so now I and my firm we're fortunate enough to represent hundreds of clients and participants in the cannabis industry in the United States and the world, from producers, literally farmers out in the field, all the way to brands and everything in between. It's been an exciting journey.
It sounds like it. Yeah. And it's interesting how you mentioned when you got started, I mean, you did smoke cannabis recreationally, as you mentioned, but when you started to really understand the medicinal benefits, especially from your condition, having testicular cancer, I mean, you're not the only one who has said. I've had other guests on the podcast, Annie Epley being one, the founder of Women in Cannabis, where she talked about her husband had some real serious health issues, and she was at a point where she had to sneak the cannabis medicine into the hospital just to get him what he needed to feel better, right? So let's talk about the endocannabinoid system, right? I feel like that is, I've had doctors on, Dr. Westerfield, and I asked him the question, what is the percentage of doctors or even medical professionals who understand what the endocannabinoid system even is? So why don't you talk about that, and what is the understanding when it comes to the medical profession for our endocannabinoid systems?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think that the understanding among medical professionals of the endocannabinoid system, or ECS, is not where it should be, and that's for sure. I remember I have a really good family physician that I've been going to for about 20 years now, and I started talking to him about the ECS several years ago, and he didn't know anything about it whatsoever. And the idea of cannabis as medicine, these were the days where it was really cannabis to most people was just smoking a joint at a party or something like that. And it took a long time for him to understand it. And then what was kind of neat is to go to my annual checkups over the years and then have him start to ask me some questions, not medical questions, but tell me a little bit more about this. So you every time you see me, you talk about this thing, and now I'm starting to read up on it, or a lot of patients are asking about it. And so I think that the education is not there. I'm really happy to be the legal advisor and write an article every quarter or every issue for the American Journal of Endocannabinoid Medicine, which is the first printed peer-reviewed medical journal for the endocannabinoid system in North America. And that has tens of thousands of offices that it goes to. And I think that's raising this awareness of the endocannabinoid system. And about the system itself, I'm no physician, so I'm not going to be able to give a very detailed information about it, but generally speaking, it's the system in our body that helps us to maintain homeostasis or equilibrium, and it impacts us in a lot of different ways. From pain modulation, it can help us with reducing pain, to other things that are out of balance. We have different seizures. It's been widely reported and studied that CBD, for instance, can help with seizure disorders, and generally speaking, a seizure disorder is our body being out of balance, and so CBD and other cannabinoids can help to reframe that. It helps with anxiety, similarly, and so if we talk about going out in the world and being in the world as an organism, and having the ability to remain in an equilibrium, as we have all sorts of these other factors that are impacting us on a moment by moment basis. we begin to realize how powerful cannabis can be if it can help us to maintain that sense of equilibrium. And I've certainly found that to be true in my life and with people that I know and care about who do suffer from anxiety or pain or whatnot. I think that most people that I've talked with about it and who use it have benefited greatly from it. So we're at the new frontier, and I look forward to to continuing to read clinical reports of more things that cannabis can do to help us out.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right when you say we're on the new frontier. And what I think is really interesting and fascinating is the contradictions by the federal government, right? Because
Right.
you've got cannabis or marijuana, the term they use, which is listed as a Schedule I narcotic. And if you look at the requirements for Schedule I, I mean, one of the requirements is no medicinal uses, right? But
Right.
your point, you just listed anxiety, seizures for epilepsy. I'm reading a book, Medical Marijuana in America, a memoir of a pioneer who is, the first medical patient, which was Robert C. Randall, who proved that, of course, cannabis helps with glaucoma. So I say contradictions because you have a body, right? The United States, where there are states that are deeming this plant, either for recreational use, for medicinal use. You have peer-reviewed studies that show that this plant can help with certain medical issues, and you've got businesses that are deemed essential during COVID, right? Yet it's still a Schedule I narcotic. So
Right.
what's the deal with that? And are we making any progress on that front to educate these policymakers as to the not only the medicinal benefits, but the industrial hemp side of it, what we can produce and make out of this plant?
Well, Kevin, so many things to unpack in that, with the federal government and its stance and how we deal with this issue of what we call federalism in law, which is the states have a certain amount of authority and sovereign authority to make laws. And so the federal government has authority, and when those clash, how does it play out? But the bottom line is it's absolutely clear that cannabis is a medicine. I mean, that's undisputed. So its Schedule I classification at the very least is just out and out wrong. And this is not new. The Controlled Substances Act was largely devised by Nixon and the Nixon administration in order to control protests and counter movements against a lot of political things that were going on at the time. And a lot of these groups used cannabis. They also used other psychedelics, LSD and whatnot. And the Controlled Substances Act, by making cannabis Schedule I, was able to allow the feds to go in and to prosecute these groups, not for what they were doing, which would have been clearly unconstitutional, not for the color of their skin, which also would have been clearly unconstitutional, but because of the drugs that they were using. And so the agenda of prosecuting people of color and prosecuting groups that they deemed to be counter to their ends was effectuated through the Controlled Substances Act. So it never was meant to be about whether it has medicinal benefit. Additionally, back in the 80s, there was an administrative law judge that was very clear about the fact that cannabis is medicine and advised the DEA to deschedule it. The DEA ignored that. And we've had petitions throughout the years, and the DEA has been, frankly, very difficult on this issue. But the U.S. government itself, aside from these administrative law judges and some favorable reports by people in different administrations, has various patents for cannabis as medicine. And so it's a clear contradiction, and clearly cannabis is medicine, and the U.S. government should deschedule it. It's simpler than it sounds, of course, but really we need the political will to do it. And I'm hoping that with the election cycle that's coming up, and there's a big movement and a lot of people who are very upset about this, and I'm hoping that will change over the next 1 to 3 years at the federal level.
Yeah, that's so hilarious that you say, I mean, as I said, contradictions, but then you mentioned that the federal government has patents for cannabis compounds. I mean,
it's crazy. I just wrote an article on Delta 8 THC, which is it's not a new cannabinoid. It's been around and studied since the 70s, but it's new to the market. And so I was writing a paper on it and looking at a lot of the Delta 8 that's produced is actually produced from CBD as the starting compound. And for some reasons that we can discuss later if you want. But in looking through this, and I was looking at SOPs from clients they had sent me so I could understand the chemical process. Well, lo and behold, the U.S. has a patent for converting, THC and CBD to other cannabinoids. There it is in black and white from the U.S. government. And that's not specifically for health, of course, but it is, the U.S. government has been studying cannabinoids for decades now, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's talk about the various cannabinoids. So you mentioned Delta 8, and the term Delta 9 gets thrown out there also. So do you want to explain to our audience the difference between Delta 8 and Delta 9? And then maybe talk about the USDA's interim final rule that requires THC concentrations to be pre-harvested and tested for Delta 9 THC.
Yeah, sure. So THC is probably the most widely known cannabinoid. It's the one that gets you high. It's also got quite a bit of medical utility. And there are 30 at least 30 THC analogs, meaning compounds that are molecules that are very similar in their structure but slightly different. And THC itself, tetrahydrocannabinols, are all Schedule 1. So marijuana, which is the legal term for cannabis with more than 0.3% THC, is a controlled substance, as we were just discussing. But also THC, it's the only cannabinoid that is specifically listed in the Controlled Substances Act. And that covers all of the different forms of THC. Delta 9 is the most notable one. It's the one that really is prominent in cannabis. Well, I take that back. THCA, which is the acid form of THC, which cannot get you high on its own, is probably the most prevalent in most strains of cannabis when that is decarboxylated. Yeah, go ahead. Did you need to jump in?
And THCA, from what I've heard from geneticists that I've had on, it's natural within the plant. It's basically serves as a way to protect the plant from UVA UV sun rays, right? To help protect the plant so it doesn't get eaten up by the sun.
Right, exactly. So it's the most prominent. And when it decarboxylates, which is a chemical change that happens from heat, notably smoking, for instance, or heating it in a brownie, if you, it changes the molecular structure. Actually, you lose a carboxyl group, and that converts to Delta 9, which is the neutral form of the compound and one of the more stable forms of it. And that's what when we think about getting high from smoking cannabis or ingesting it, that's Delta 9 that we're primarily experiencing and thinking about. Well, there are other types of THC compounds. Delta 8 is almost exactly like Delta 9 at the molecular level, except for there's a double bond, and the double bond is just located in a different position. And that positioning of the bond impacts the way it affects us on a personal level. If you've tried it, for people who've tried it, who are listening to this, Delta 8 has about 50 to 60% of the psychoactive potency or effects in most people. It's a powerful antiemetic, which means that it will help with nausea and vomiting and that type of thing. Actually, one of the main studies on it was done with children undergoing chemotherapy in the 70s, used Delta 8, and it helped them across the board, 100% efficacy. But it also tends to have less of the anxiety-producing effects that Delta 9 can. Interestingly, with respect to hemp, it is legal when it is derived from hemp. And this kind of goes into your question about hemp. But I'll start by saying Delta 8 THC, just in the abstract, is a scheduled substance in the Controlled Substances Act. And certainly when it comes from marijuana, it's controlled. However, when it comes from hemp, it's a different picture. Hemp is cannabis sativa that has no more than 0.3% THC. And the THC that is in hemp is actually not a controlled substance. It's been exempted or pulled from that. And so if you were to pull Delta 8 THC from the plant, it's absolutely clear that it's lawful. The law says Delta 9 THC is the concentrations or the cannabinoid that's limited. All other cannabinoids are unlimited in concentrations they can have. That's why CBD from hemp is not a controlled substance. So Delta 8 from hemp is not a controlled substance. The problem, and when we really get to the nitpicky piece of this and the marketing of Delta 8, is that most plant genetics, in fact, probably all of them at this stage, don't produce meaningful amounts of Delta 8 THC. And a standard decarboxylation of THCA, which they produce in abundant quantities, it goes to Delta 9, not to Delta 8 by and large. And so it's difficult to get Delta 8 from a hemp plant. So what happens on the market is you see a lot of products that are derived from other cannabinoids. Most notably, we were talking about the patent earlier, from CBD. So you pull CBD from a hemp plant, and it's lawful based on the Farm Act and the source rule, which says that the source of a cannabinoid determines its legal status. And then you convert that in a chemical process to Delta 8 THC. And there's some debate about this. By the way, I'm not giving any legal advice. This is brand new and novel. And if you're going to market Delta 8 THC, you should talk with a lawyer first, for sure. But the legal position that I have, and I've written about it and I've talked about it with other lawyers, and most agree, is that because CBD is lawful, it's from hemp. And in fact, the way the statute is written, it is hemp. So a derivative of hemp is under the law, hemp itself. Delta 8 THC is a derivative of CBD, which means it's a derivative of hemp. So it's also lawful. But this is brand new. This is novel. I expect that we'll probably see over the next 12 to 24 months some court cases dealing with this issue. So it's an exciting time, but it's also a time where there's some risk involved. So again, if you're a business owner who's wanting to go into Delta 8 THC, make sure that you talk about it with a lawyer and understand what the risks are and what those legal arguments are about it.
Yeah, no, there definitely are risks, especially from some of the, or most of the farmers that I've spoken with, to make sure that their crop doesn't go hot, which means, to your point earlier, the THC levels being above 0.3. But I recently saw, I think you tweeted it, that there is now a petition for Congress to allow 1% THC in hemp. Which I think would make everyone's lives a little easier in terms of, the growing aspect. Because again, the plant naturally has THCA. It's one of the geneticists I talked to, Adam Jock, said it's impossible to remove THC from the plant, like have it have zero THC. I think that they may be working on it, but right now I don't think that that's possible.
I have heard that there are strains that have 0%. And there's a couple of questions. A, is that true? And B, what does 0% mean? Really, is it 0.01, 0.001, there? So, and that can make a difference, particularly when you're doing an extraction and you're concentrating all of the cannabinoids that are in a plant. Suddenly, those very minute concentrations begin to add up, so to speak. But yeah, there's a lot again to unpack in your question. So, this 0.3% Delta 9 THC is workable. Well, first of all, that's an arbitrary wall there between hemp and marijuana. The 0.3% Delta 9 THC doesn't make any difference on a chemical level or a biological level. It was just an arbitrary number that was fixed. But when we're talking about Delta 9, as you indicated, most of the plant varieties have higher levels of THCA, but not a whole lot in Delta 9 itself. But when those plants are pulled out of the ground and they're heated up, then the THCA converts to Delta 9, and you can have higher levels of Delta 9 THC. And so what the USDA has done is it said, well, we interpret the statute to require testing to not only account for Delta 9 THC, but potential Delta 9 THC, which is THCA that would otherwise convert to Delta 9 if heat were applied or degraded. And because of that, most hemp varieties are going to go hot. In other words, they're going to test above this level, and a lot of farmers are going to be out of luck. And we don't want that for our farmers. And so there is a petition out there, Vote Hemp, to have Congress just raise that level to 1%, which would provide a wider berth and margin of error for farmers who are out there trying to get this new crop to the world. So I certainly hope that people will tell their Congress folks that we should raise this limit to 1% for sure. It would help farmers. It would help the industry quite a bit.
Yes, you heard it from Rod. Sign that petition. I want to be this podcast because you're right. To your point, it would make everyone's lives easier, and it would open up more opportunity in this fast emerging industry that we're barely scratching the surface of.
Yeah, and there are a lot of issues that I think are not thought about. So. So say we use the 0.3% total THC, and a farmer's growing a crop, but what they're growing it for is, say, for smokable flower. Smokable hemp flower is becoming a thing. It's firmly ingrained in a lot of states, and it's a popular product. Well, let's say a farmer grows a crop, and the USDA representative comes out and takes a sample, which is typically the top third of the plant, sends it off, and it comes back total THC below 0.3%. Great, no problem. Farmer harvests that crop and then trims the top flower, which is where the trichomes are that produce the most abundant sources of cannabinoids, including THC. Trims that off, packages up, ships it off to sell. And then that package gets stopped by law enforcement for whatever reason. And I'm giving kind of a simplistic example here. Law enforcement pulls that package out, sends it off for testing. Well, guess what? It's possible and even likely that that flower is going to test higher than 0.3%. So we've got a situation in which a farmer lawfully grew a crop. It was tested and approved, but because of the nature of this particular product, which is the top portion of that plant, where the cannabinoids are concentrated, that is going to potentially be deemed to be illegal by law enforcement in whatever state this was, or maybe even by the DEA. And so what do we do with this situation? And something as simple as bumping this up to 1% is gonna solve a lot of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, what other positions are you seeing related to hemp and CBD from the perspective of the USDA, the FDA, and other federal agencies?
Yeah.
I know that one came up when I posted that you're going to be on the podcast, and someone wanted to know, like, where are we at when it comes to cattle cannabinoid feed updates? You know what I mean? Like, can we, because I know that there's been opposition to even feed our cattle hemp seeds and hemp grain when that was the norm, before the 1930s.
Right. It was. We're not seeing a lot of progress. Congress is held up in a number of other things right now, and some of these federal agencies are just dragging their feet. The federal agency that's dragging its feet the most is the FDA. I testified to the FDA about CBD a year and a half ago, and only recently, in the past week or so, did it finally release a report. And the report is talking about, essentially pesticides and labeling issues that we've known about for years. And what the FDA says is that CBD cannot be used as a food ingredient, cannot be marketed as a dietary supplement, and that no medical or dietary supplement claims can be made about it. And this, despite the fact that you can walk into just just about any convenience store or go online and find all sorts of CBD food and dietary supplement products, and people are using them, and it's helping people in a lot of different ways. And rather than have the FDA come in and regulate it, so that these problems that we do see, where there are mislabeling, there are bad claims that mislead people, or there's junk in the, for lack of a better term, in these products that shouldn't be there because of bad manufacturing practices. Instead of having the FDA take a lead, the FDA has continued to step back and not led some, been a leader, I should say. And so it's been really disappointing. And so we have a largely unregulated industry. It's regulated at the state level, local level, and mostly it's self-regulated. And so I think that's disappointing, but we will in the next several years begin to see CBD regulation. And we're also seeing other cannabinoids. We're going to see them being regulated as well. And hopefully they'll be regulated in a way that allows widespread access to safe products without all the other stuff that, restrictions on this and that and all sorts of complicated and gray areas that we're seeing right now.
Mm-hmm. And just to dive in a bit further into these cannabinoids, I know the major cannabinoids that we talk about, THC being one, CBD being another, but there are also minor cannabinoids that are emerging, like CBG and CBN, and you touched on Delta 8 THC. So what trends are you seeing with these new identified cannabinoids in the market?
Yeah, well, CBG is the mother cannabinoid. It's the cannabinoid from which most other cannabinoids stem, and it appears to have quite a bit of potential to help with a lot of medical issues. And so I think that it's likely that we'll begin to see more and more CBG on the market. On the other hand, CBG doesn't get you high. It doesn't at all. I've actually I ingest quite a bit of CBG, and I can tell you it doesn't get you high at all. I ingest it for the medical properties that it has. And so I think to the typical consumer, CBD, CBG, all these CBs, whatever, I think it may be difficult to differentiate CBG in the market. On the other hand, you have something like CBN, which depending on which study you read, could potentially have some be a big sleep aid. The sleep aid industry is tens of billions of dollars, and if CBN really can show across multiple studies that it does promote sleep, then I think it could be a complete game changer for the sleep industry and for the cannabis industry at large. The difficulty with CBN is that it's difficult to grow. It's much like Delta 8. You don't really see strains of cannabis that produce CBN, because CBN is the product of a degradation of THC. And so it's mostly created through time, heat, or some other chemical process. And that makes it a little more difficult to get out into the market. But it's there on the market right now. You can definitely find some CBN products, and I think we'll be starting to see a little bit more of those. Earlier this year, I actually predicted that CBN was the next CBD, the next big cannabinoid. We'll see. Delta 8 seems to be doing, giving it a run for its money. But I think over the next 18 months, we're going to see these minor or novel cannabinoids out on the market in a real way, and that's exciting.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And I mean, and it is clear that the FDA is, dragging their feet when it comes to regulating these various cannabinoids. And so, what are you seeing internationally? I know that you've talked about on your website and your blog the Novel Foods Directive regarding CBD in the European Union. So, tell us what measures they're taking from a consumable standpoint when it comes to the cannabinoids.
Yeah, so the international space for the cannabis industry is emerging rapidly, and it's exciting. And every country or region is different. With respect to the European Union, it has what's called the Novel Foods Directive, which just says that a food or ingredient that has not been used in the European Union prior to, and forgive me on the dates here, I don't have my notes, but I think it's 1997, has to be approved for safety, not efficacy. In other words, it doesn't. You don't have to show that it does something. You just have to prove that it's safe, and that can be a new ingredient that's developed by a chemical process. It can also be a food that's widely consumed in another part of the world, but not traditionally in the European Union. And that is a very technical application that to get approved, where you submit an application, you describe all the properties of the food, the way it was derived, the processing and manufacturing of it. You run test studies, clinical studies to show that it's safe under certain conditions. And so this is part of the European Union, and it's just a regular part of it. The way it applies to CBD and other cannabinoids is that the Commission has decided and determined that CBD is a novel food, and therefore it cannot be marketed in the European Union, at least as a food. Topically, that's different, at least as a food, without it being approved first. And so, much like the United States, in our situation, if you go to Europe, you'll see CBD all over the place. Countries are different. Some countries are more restrictive than others. You'll see CBD, and the Novel Foods Directive is not being enforced quite as rigorously as probably the Commission would want it to be. But the bottom line for manufacturers and retailers of CBD products is, in order to get your products into Europe lawfully, and then you have to submit an application and have it approved. And these applications can take years, literally, for approval. They're not just fill out a piece of paper. You've got to dive in deep. It can take 6-12 months to even put together an application before it's even looked at to be approved. And so we're beginning to see companies really engage with this process. We're advising a number of clients who are wanting to put their products into the EU. Interestingly, and not to get too technical on this, because there's a lot of technical pieces, Brexit, which is where the UK is breaking away from the European Union, has caused a situation where the UK says, well, we also have a novel foods directive. We're going to abide by it, but we're not going to start pulling products from the shelves until March of next year. So we're going to give companies a little more time to submit that application. And if they submit the application before that expiration date next March, well, then they can continue to market their products while their applications are being evaluated. So the UK is an interesting gateway, so to speak, into the EU for purposes of marketing CBD products. But yeah, I think all in all, with the international space, and in particular Europe, we're seeing cannabis emerge very rapidly. It's kind of jumping through the hoops that the U.S. has, but a lot quicker. And in a lot of ways, it's doing it better. And I think that if the FDA and some other federal agencies don't get on the stick and really begin to regulate CBD and cannabinoids properly, we're going to be eclipsed by the European Union.
Yep. Yeah, that's a big threat right now for sure. And are there any countries specifically that you would call out that are really leading the charge when it comes to not only regulatory standards, but also just, growing this industry and the pace of how it's growing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there a lot of different countries get certain pieces right and get other pieces wrong. There are some South American countries, Uruguay, Colombia, that from a production standpoint, talking about cultivating cannabis, seem to be doing a lot of good and supporting their farmers and promoting what's eventually just going to be an export market to other countries. In Europe, you've got countries like Germany that is really going all in on the medical side and promoting a medical system. I just mentioned the UK with CBD seems to be forward thinking in terms of how to get CBD to safe CBD to its population. Canada's been around for a long time with its cannabis industry and has connected that to its medical system, I think, in a really good way. No single country has done it, exactly right, of course, but we can see pieces from different countries where it is doing right. And I would like to see eventually some sort of unification. We're never going to see a unification of all the laws, but where we can really do import, export, and international trade in a way that is much more consistent. And I think we're probably 5 to 10 years away from that.
Well, that's a perfect segue because I was going to ask you about how you envision the future of cannabis regulation. Maybe start with the U.S. and then kind of expand on a global level.
Sure. So the U.S., it's just a matter of time before marijuana is either removed from the Controlled Substances Act or at least bumped down the line a little bit to a less restrictive classification. Certainly, I would think it needs to be removed completely. But I think we're going to see that happen. And when that happens, we're still going to have state by state regulations, and some states will be stricter than others. But I think as a nation, we'll see much more cross-border transactions with cannabis.
Well, to that point, I think I just read an article, I think it was published today, where it's talking about Biden's campaign is proposing a marijuana plan to move Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. Obviously, it's an election year. This is the first time I've heard either candidate really speak to cannabis and the regulatory issues that are currently in place with it. So the article basically said that move wouldn't help much at all. I mean, what is your thought on moving cannabis or marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2? Which Schedule 2, what cocaine falls under that? I think Oxycontin and pain or heroin falls under that. Is that correct? Or
yeah, Schedule 2 is not much of a help. In fact, it may actually hinder things going forward because it might be seen as meaningful reform where it's actually not. And in many respects, I think rescheduling it, reclassifying it to Schedule 2 is just a giveaway to Big Pharma. And there are certainly pharmaceutical applications for cannabinoids, and I support those for specific types of medicines and types of indications. But cannabis is much, much larger than Big Pharma. People can use it in all ways, from growing cannabis for fiber or their own personal use in their backyards to making dietary supplements and food ingredients to these pharmaceutical applications. And the moving to Schedule 2 is just a giveaway to Big Pharma without helping the rest of us, frankly. So I think Biden is way off base on that. And I personally reached out to the Biden campaign and said, Biden is off base on cannabis. He can really appeal to the voters and really make some meaningful reform if he wants to. And I didn't hear back. I don't think it's high on his list right now, unfortunately. But I do think we will see some rescheduling one way or another within the United States within the next several years. And the United States continues to be seen, I think, as a leader in many things. And I think that the U.S. moving in that direction will encourage other countries to move in that direction, which moves us into this international piece that we're talking about. Several countries have begun to either decriminalize or reschedule or remove cannabis from their Controlled Substances Act and from their criminal statutes. And so we're beginning to see that in Europe and in some other countries. But in order for all this to really take hold and for cannabis to be truly an international commodity, we're going to have to do some adjustments on an international level with treaties. And my friend and colleague Bob Hoban, who's another cannabis lawyer, wrote an article in Forbes just this week about this very issue. I think it's very timely that we do have to go through and amend treaties in order for countries to participate and really change their laws in a way that will be effective. And that's a tough, long slog for sure. But it's going to happen. You know, you and I talking 10 years from now, we're going to see a completely different situation on the international level.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's conversations like what we're having now. You know, obviously the mission of this podcast is to just educate and inform listeners about, you know, not only the medicinal benefits, but also the economic impact that this plant could have, not only in the United States, but globally. Right.
Absolutely.
So let's switch gears and talk about the business of cannabis. So from your perspective, what are some of the major challenges that either you know, recreational THC companies face, or even you know, industrial hemp companies, farmers, processors, things like that? What are challenges that you're seeing right now?
Gosh, I could pull out a computer printed list of page after page of challenges to identify a handful. You know, I would say the number one challenge for marijuana THC side is the two challenges are banking, and then that is to say lack of access to banking and tax issues. So banking is pretty straightforward. The marijuana THC companies just don't have any real access to banking, and that's just a fundamental thing for doing business. I mean, you've got to be able to access financial institutions and to transfer money safely and consistently and efficiently. There's been some movement on that front, but it's just not gone nearly far enough. The other big issue is the tax disadvantages of engaging in a marijuana business. There's a statute called 280E is the section number, and it says that, well, with respect to marijuana, a company that is engaging in a marijuana in the marijuana trade cannot take the normal deductions that a business that all other businesses take. So, for example, you know, a bicycle shop, you know, at the end of the year, it's in, you know, X amount of money, but before it doesn't pay taxes on all that money. It pays taxes on a reduced amount, namely its profit. And the difference between the gross revenue and the profit has to do with deductions that are allowed. Things like, you know, paying your employees, paying your rent, paying your light bill, your marketing, and so on and so forth. All these line items that have to be paid in order to run that business. You're not paying taxes on that revenue unless you're a marijuana company. You're not allowed to take those deductions. So we have these situations in which the taxes that a marijuana company is paying are just outlandish. They're inconceivable to normal business folks. And that really hurts the industry significantly. 280E should be repealed or at least modified as it applies to marijuana companies.
When you talk about the taxation and those challenges, is that nationwide, or does that differ by state? And I asked that because I had a lawyer on, a cannabis lawyer, Mark Wasserman, Pop Brothers at Law from California, and he was talking about how the taxation in California is so high. Is that the same for states, or does it differ?
So we do have two different tax schemes. So if you're a marijuana company, cannabis company operating in California, you're subject to federal taxes because you're all of us have to file our income tax returns, and that's this issue that I'm talking about. But Mark has a very great point on the state taxes. States levy their own taxes, and while they may not follow the 280E rubric, it's mostly a sort of a sales tax that we're talking about in terms of and use taxes and things like that. Is how do we set those taxes? So a lot of the push for legalization is, we're going to give states back all this revenue and whatnot, which is great. But in order to set that tax rate right, if you set it too high, then people are going to continue to acquire their cannabis from the black market. You know, if you set it too low, well, then states are not going to derive the benefit that they need to support, you know, the cannabis companies and all the other things that they do. So setting that number is crucial. And a lot of states, California most notably, have not done the best job of setting that figure. And you also have issues where you've got local types of taxes and things. So it's not just one tax. You've got stacked taxes that marijuana companies have to deal with, and it can be very oppressive in certain situations.
Mm. Well,
and this is coming from someone who, I mean, I pay my taxes, and I believe, I don't mind it when it goes to the good. So I'm not dissing taxes per se. I'm saying that we need policies that promote, that help to promote the industry rather than taking away from it.
well, we got to give these cannabis entrepreneurs a fighting chance, right? I mean,
that's exactly right. Absolutely.
yeah. So another question would be, what would you advise smart business practices for managing cash in a cannabis business, especially during a time like COVID, during this pandemic? What advice would you offer cannabis business owners?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote an article recently about, COVID and cannabis businesses that arose out of my experience in my sort of prior legal career of being a bankruptcy lawyer and helping with a lot of restructuring for businesses. And there's some common sense things that can be done. So, for example, if a cannabis company leases a building that for its production or for its retail or whatnot, it's a good idea to go to the landlord and see if you can renegotiate the lease based on the new reality of reduced income, whether it be a short-term modification or maybe modifies the whole lease going forward. The same goes with creditors. Maybe there's a business line of credit that the company uses. Of course, that doesn't happen a whole lot with respect to cannabis companies because banks won't give credit. But maybe there's some private investors that have loaned money to the company expecting a return. Well, maybe go to those investors or go to those lenders and talk to them about restructuring the terms so that you're not just hemorrhaging cash without it coming back in. Those two things are key. Also, going in and looking at your efficiencies. When cannabis can produce quite a bit of revenue, and sometimes that wash of revenue that can come in from great sales can cover up a lot of inefficiencies and redundancies that should be tightened up. So go through your books and find out, and determine where are these redundancies and inefficiencies, and how can we cut back and be a little bit smarter about those things. So there are things that companies can and should be doing in order to make sure that they survive and weather the storm. And as you indicated, some states have determined that cannabis is necessary. And those states, that's great. Other states and other situations, they haven't. So we have cannabis companies that are doing great right now, and we have cannabis companies that are really struggling right now. With respect to a lot of hemp and CBD products, what I've seen is that storefronts, whether they be dispensaries or some other type of a retail, are struggling. Retail outlets are struggling across the board right now. On the other hand, direct to consumer, which is where they sell online, are doing really well because more people are moving to online sales. And so to the extent that you're able to move to online sales, and some companies can and some companies can't, I think that's an important component. And then finally, I think customer service. These all sound like cliches, but they're really true. Something as simple as customer service can really help, so that you have a loyal following who's going to stick with you through the rough times. And that can be as simple as friendly phone service when people call. It can be implementing a delivery service that's free or reduced, or things like that, so that your customers will identify you as the one they want to work with and stick with you.
Right. No, I mean, those are basic things, but they're fundamental, right? I mean, brand loyalty.
Absolutely.
Huge. And the more that you can really serve your customer in the best way possible, they're going to be flocking back. They're going to be coming back to you every time. So
this is the time where brand loyalty is beginning to become a thing. And we've seen a lot of some of the bigger known entities that are in free fall right now and having some real struggles. And so brands that we thought might be the brands of the future may not be. And so this is really the time to consolidate your audience and your customer base, whatever your customers may be, or if they're consumers, end use consumers, or even if they're if you're a B2B business, if you're selling wholesale product to other businesses, still creating that niche and that loyalty, I think is vital at this moment in time.
Absolutely. No, that's great advice, Rod. And, I really appreciate you being on and sharing your expertise with us. I know you're a busy man and you're jumping from meetings to meetings. So to give us this hour, of your time. I really appreciate it. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with? And if you'd like to plug any social media channels or your blog, now's the time to go ahead and do that.
Sure. Well, thanks. Well, I'll say a few things. First, Kevin, thanks for having me on. Your questions have been great. You do a great job. And education, as you say, is really the key right now. I think that those of us in the industry kind of take it for granted that everyone knows about these things we're talking about. And the fact of the matter is, the people in power who, our politicians and the regulators, by and large, don't know these things. And if the consumers and the businesses can know them and educate the politicians and the regulators, that's going to help us all out. Which moves me to my next piece, which is to those of you that are listening, I do think it's important that you reach out to your local, meaning your local, your state and your federal your politicians and regulators, and let them know that this is an important issue for you. And in particular, if there's a specific issue or two that applies to you personally or to your business, let those politicians know. And then finally, I'm certainly happy to respond to questions and to help out with legal issues. I write a legal blog, Kight on Cannabis.com, KIGHT on Cannabis.com, and you can read articles. We try to write and analyze issues across the spectrum. I just wrote an article on Delta-8 THC, and then followed that with we have an article on the Oregon's ODA and how they're changing some policies with respect to hemp production. So we really try to cover the bases so that people can go in and type a search query into our blog and find something that's helpful to them. So please visit the blog and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.
Yep. I have the blog bookmarked on my computer. It is a great resource for information. Y'all are doing a great job on the content side. So keep it up. And I appreciate you being on, and I hope to have you on again in the near future as things develop in this industry.
Well, I look forward to it, Kevin. Thanks a lot.
All right, Rod. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for listening. We'll be back again soon. Bye.